The smell of antiseptic and wet fur filled the air as Mark stepped through the doors of the city animal shelter. It wasn't his first visit, but this time felt different. The walls were lined with cages, each holding a hopeful face or a pair of tired eyes. The chorus of barking echoed off the concrete, but Mark barely noticed. He wasn't here to adopt. Not really. At least, that's what he told himself. He still wasn't over Max, his golden retriever who'd passed 6 months earlier. The house had been quiet since then. Too quiet. Sometimes, late at night, Mark swore he could still hear Max's paws patting across the hardwood floor. He came to the shelter now and then just to walk the dogs, help where he could. It made the silence a little easier to bear. Looking for anyone in particular today? A young volunteer asked, clipboard in hand. No, Mark replied softly. Just browsing. She nodded and gestured toward the kennels. Feel free to look around. Let me know if you have questions. Mark walked past rows of cages. Pit bulls with wagging tails, beagles barking for attention, labs pacing in circles. But one kennel, toward the far end, stopped him cold. It wasn't the barking that drew him in, but the silence. The dog inside didn't move, just sat there, still as a statue, staring straight ahead. A large German shepherd, muscles taut beneath a coat of scarred fur. His ears were half folded back, and a long, jagged scar traced the edge of his snout. One eye held a glint of amber, the other slightly clouded. But what shook Mark most was the stillness. Not fear, not anger, just still. Something about the dog made Mark step closer. He leaned toward the cage, peering through the mesh. The dog turned its head slowly, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked. There was no growl, no bark, just a quiet connection. Something passed between them. Something Mark couldn't name. Whoa, whoa. Sir, not that one, a firm voice interrupted. Mark turned. A shelter staff member in a faded green polo shirt stood behind him, eyes wide. We don't let people near him. He's not safe. Mark glanced back at the dog. Still unmoving. Still watching. What's the story? He asked. The staff member hesitated, then sighed. Brutus. 3-time return. Failed out of a training program. Snapped at a handler once. He's unpredictable. Can't be around other dogs. We've had him for months. Honestly, we're just waiting for a decision from animal control. A decision. Mark knew what that meant. Has he ever actually hurt anyone? He asked quietly. No, but he's scared people. Big time. We don't recommend him. In fact, we discourage it. Mark didn't respond. His eyes were still on Brutus, who hadn't moved an inch. Something about that dog's silence was louder than all the barking in the room. He didn't look aggressive. He looked tired, like something had broken in him long ago, and no one had tried to fix it. The volunteer returned, noticing the tension. You're better off with one of the labs. Oh, we got a sweet collie mix in the back. Mark nodded slowly, tearing his gaze away. Thanks. I'll take a look. But as he walked down the row, passing cage after cage, his feet felt heavy. The faces blurred together, tails wagging, paws scraping, tongues lolling. But none of them pulled at him the way Brutus had. When he reached the end of the aisle, he turned back. Brutus was still there, still watching, still silent, and in Mark's chest, a strange pull began to grow. He didn't know why. He didn't have a plan. But somehow he knew he wasn't leaving without that dog. Mark stood at the front desk of the shelter, pen hovering over the paperwork. A waiver form lay before him, bold words underlined in red ink. Adopter acknowledges dog has shown aggressive behavior. The clerk looked at him with thinly veiled concern. Are you absolutely sure about this, sir? You still have time to reconsider. No pressure. Mark looked past her, through the small window toward the kennels. Brutus sat quietly, his hulking form barely visible through the narrow glass. Still watching. Still waiting. I'm sure, Mark said, signing his name in a firm stroke. The clerk sighed. All right, then, let me get his release papers. Within minutes, Brutus was led out by a shelter worker gripping the leash tightly with both hands. The dog didn't resist, didn't lunge or growl, but his muscles were tight, coiled like a spring. His eyes darted around the room, scanning corners and doorways. He moved like someone who never felt safe. "Just be careful," the worker said, handing over the leash reluctantly. "He doesn't like loud noises or fast movements. And never reach over his head." Mark knelt down slowly, holding the leash loose in his fingers. "Hey, big guy," he murmured. Brutus stood still, eyes flicking toward him, then to the door, like he was already calculating escape routes. The ride home was quiet. Brutus sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his body rigid, head held low. He didn't whine or bark. He just watched, out the window, at Mark, at the rear-view mirror, constantly alert. Mark glanced over. "You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder. No one's coming for you." Brutus didn't react, but Mark could swear, just for a second, his ear twitched. At home, Mark opened the front door and stepped aside. Brutus didn't move. "It's okay," Mark said gently. "You're safe here." The dog hesitated, then cautiously padded inside. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if expecting a trap. Mark left the leash on, just in case. Brutus sniffed the air, nose twitching as he passed the furniture, the walls, the fireplace. His tail stayed low, not tucked, but not relaxed either. The living room light was warm, the space quiet. Mark sat on the edge of the sofa and watched as Brutus paced a small circle before settling in a corner, his back to the wall. From there, he could see every entry point. Mark didn't approach. He just let the silence stretch, letting Brutus take the lead. Later that evening, while making tea in the kitchen, Mark caught the faint sound of a low growl. He turned quickly. Brutus was standing now, staring at the back door, muscles tense, ears pinned. "Easy," Mark said softly as he peeked through the curtain. Nothing but a raccoon rustling in the trash bin. Mark turned back. "Just a raccoon, buddy." Brutus didn't ease up until minutes later, but he didn't bark. He simply resumed his place in the corner, never once taking his eyes off the door. That night, Mark laid out an old comforter beside the fireplace. He set down a water bowl and a couple of treats. Brutus approached slowly, sniffing once before settling onto the blanket with a heavy, reluctant sigh. Mark sat nearby, arms on his knees. He didn't speak, didn't try to touch him, just sat in the quiet. "You don't trust me yet," he said finally. "That's okay. I wouldn't either." Brutus didn't look up, but he didn't move away either. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, two souls, both scarred in their own ways, shared a space for the first time. Neither knew it yet, but this was the beginning of something neither of them had ever truly known. The first week passed in cautious silence. Mark kept his routine steady, waking up early, cooking in quiet, speaking in low, reassuring tones. He didn't force anything. He let Brutus roam the house, kept doors open so he could choose where to go, where to lie. Still, Brutus stuck mostly to the corner near the fireplace, always watching, always measuring. Then the storm came. It rolled in quickly, dark clouds swallowing the sky, thunder grumbling low in the distance. Mark stood at the kitchen window, sipping his coffee as raindrops pattered against the glass. Brutus was in the hallway, lying down, calm until the first crack of thunder split the sky in half. The sound was sharp, violent. Brutus bolted upright, his chest heaving. Another rumble, closer this time. And that's when it happened. A sudden flash of lightning lit the room, and Brutus snapped. He scrambled across the hardwood floor, claws skittering for grip, crashing into a side table. Mark jumped back as the dog growled, not at him, but at the storm, at the room, at the shadows around him. Panic surged through every muscle in Brutus's body. He lunged at the door, pawing at it violently, whimpering and snarling in turns. "Brutus!" Mark called, keeping his voice firm, but calm. "It's okay. Easy, boy. Easy." But Brutus didn't hear him. He was somewhere else. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere cold and loud and cruel. Mark took one careful step forward. The growl came instantly. Low, threatening. Mark stopped. His hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with understanding. This wasn't aggression. This was terror. He slowly backed away and sat on the edge of the couch, lowering himself to the dog's eye level, but from a safe distance. The thunder roared again, and Brutus pressed his body flat to ground, tail between his legs, teeth bared. Not at Mark, but at the invisible ghost surrounding him. Mark didn't speak this time. He simply waited. Minutes passed. The storm began to roll away. The thunder grew softer, the rain lighter, and gradually Brutus stopped shaking. Eventually, he turned his head slightly, just enough to see Mark sitting there. Not chasing, not yelling, not throwing anything, just sitting. It was the first time Brutus made eye contact since the storm started. The next morning, Mark walked into the hallway to find Brutus lying just outside the bedroom door. A silent shift, a new beginning. Later that day, while brushing Brutus's fur, Mark's hand passed over a patch of thick, knotted hair near his ribs. He gently parted it and found a scar beneath, long, jagged. "Old!" Mark paused, eyes tracing the wound. "Where did you get that, huh?" Brutus didn't flinch. He just stood still, letting Mark touch him. That night, Mark lit a fire and lay down next to Brutus on the rug, a worn towel in his lap. Gently, patiently, he rubbed the towel along Brutus's legs, his side, his neck. Each touch brought a small win, a tiny step closer. "I don't know what happened to you," Mark whispered, "but you're safe now. You hear me?" Brutus exhaled a soft, almost human sigh, his eyes fluttering closed for the first time without watching the door. And in that moment, Mark realized something. This wasn't a dangerous dog. This was a soul, broken, bruised, and begging to be understood. The next few days passed with strange, delicate rhythm. Brutus had begun following Mark from room to room. Never too close, never underfoot, but always there. A quiet shadow, a silent guardian. He no longer flinched at every creak of the floorboards. The growls had stopped. The eyes still held caution. But now, something else flickered behind them. Recognition, familiarity, maybe even trust. But questions still gnawed at Mark's mind. One evening, curiosity got the better of him. He sat down at his desk and opened the adoption folder the shelter had given him. Inside were intake forms, behavioral notes, medical files, and a few handwritten observations from previous adopters. He flipped through, scanning the notes. Returned after 5 days. Attempted to bite when startled. Extremely alert. Shows guarding behavior. Snapped at delivery person. Likely reactive, possibly protective. Mark's eyes narrowed at one highlighted entry, dated nearly a year ago. Dog intervened during home break-in. Protected child. Bit intruder, no serious injury. No charges filed, but family surrendered dog days later due to liability concerns. Mark read it again, slowly. "He saved someone," he murmured, stunned. "And they gave him up for it?" He sat back in his chair, the pages resting in his lap. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees. Inside, Brutus lay curled at the hearth, eyes open and alert, his gaze fixed on the front door, even in rest. Something began to fall into place. Brutus wasn't unpredictable. He was trained, conditioned, not just to guard, but to protect. And perhaps he'd never learn when to stop. Mark leaned forward, setting the papers aside. "I think I get it now," he said quietly. "You weren't the problem, were you? People just didn't know how to listen to what you were trying to say." The next day, Mark decided to test a theory. He took Brutus to the garage, where he kept some old gear, an agility tunnel, cones, a rope tug, relics from the days when he used to train Max. Brutus watched as Mark set the course in the backyard. When Mark gave a low whistle and pointed to the tunnel, Brutus hesitated, then moved. Not fast, not confident, but with precision. He ducked into the tunnel, emerged smoothly, sat when Mark lifted his hand, lay down at a single word. Mark stared in disbelief. "You were trained, weren't you? Someone taught you all this." Brutus wagged his tail just once, barely more than a twitch, but it was there. That evening, Mark sat with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip low across the hills. Brutus lay beside him now, closer than before. His head rested near Mark's foot, the lines in his body softer. The tension had eased slightly. A friend dropped by unexpectedly. As the car pulled into the driveway, Brutus tensed, ears up, body alert. When the doorbell rang, he rose and placed himself between Mark and the door. Not growling, not barking, just standing. Mark opened the door slowly. His old friend Greg smiled wide. "Hey, man, thought I'd stop by." Brutus didn't move. He simply watched. Steady, measuring. Greg glanced down at him. "Is this the one you adopted? Looks intense." Mark placed a hand on Brutus's shoulder. "Yeah, he's got your back before he even knows your name." Greg laughed nervously. "You sure he's safe?" Mark smiled. "He's safer than most people I know." Brutus sat down, eyes still on Greg, but no longer tense. And in that moment, Mark realized something profound. Brutus didn't just have a past. He had a purpose. Morning sunlight spilled through the living room windows, painting warm streaks across the wooden floor. Brutus lay in the beam of light, eyes half closed, his breathing steady. It was the first time Mark had seen him that relaxed, fully, vulnerably still. Something was changing. Every day, Brutus allowed himself a little more peace. He began greeting Mark at the door, tail wagging, not wildly, but just enough to speak volumes. He followed Mark outside, sniffing the garden, inspecting the fence line like a sentry. No barking, no panic, just presence. Mark smiled more now. Each morning, he filled Brutus's bowl and made his own coffee. They shared quiet routines, sitting on the porch, listening to birdsong, watching the wind rustle the trees. Brutus would sit at Mark's side, head high, eyes soft. The tension that once wrapped around him like a second skin had started to loosen. Mark decided it was time for the next step. He clipped on the leash one cool afternoon and opened the truck door. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go see the world." Brutus jumped in with surprising ease. They drove to a quiet nature trail on the edge of town. No traffic, no noise, just trees, earth, and sky. Mark opened the door and unhooked the leash. For a moment, Brutus didn't move. Then he ran, not wild or reckless, but free, ears back, legs stretching, paws pounding the dirt with silent grace. He made wide circles, looping around trees, always returned to Mark's side. It was the first time Mark saw him truly alive. Halfway down the trail, they passed a group of children walking with their parents. The kids pointed at Brutus excitedly. One of them, a little boy, reached out instinctively. Brutus tensed, his body stilled. Mark immediately stepped in, kneeling between them. "Gentle," he said firmly, placing a calming hand on Brutus's shoulder. The dog looked up at him, searching, uncertain. Mark smiled. "It's okay." The boy reached out again, slower this time. His tiny fingers brushed Brutus's fur. Brutus didn't move. After a few seconds, the boy pulled back and giggled. "He's soft." Brutus watched him walk away, his ears finally relaxing. Back home, the changes continued. Brutus began sleeping in the hallway outside Mark's bedroom. Then, a few nights later, he wandered in and laid down at the foot of the bed. He didn't ask permission. He just chose to be there. Mark pretended not to notice, but he did, deeply. Some nights, Mark would sit beside the fire and talk aloud, not for any reason, just to get the thoughts out. "You know," he said one evening, swirling tea in his mug, "I didn't think I could do this again. After Max, I didn't think I had it in me." Brutus lifted his head, watching him quietly. "But you," Mark continued, voice softer now, "you're different. You're not just filling a space. You're healing something." Brutus stood and crossed the room. Slowly, gently, he laid his head in Mark's lap. Mark froze. Then, with a shaky breath, he set his mug down and placed a hand on the dog's head. The fire crackled. The silence wrapped around them like a blanket. "You're not dangerous," Mark whispered. "You're just waiting for someone to believe in you." Brutus's eyes closed. In that quiet moment, man and dog, two lives marked by loss, finally found a kind of peace. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And for the first time since he brought Brutus home, Mark no longer felt alone. It had been 3 weeks since Brutus came home. 3 weeks of quiet change. of soft mornings, cautious walks, and unspoken trust building between two souls who had nearly given up. Brutus was no longer the haunted shadow Mark first met. He was still vigilant, but now there was peace in his posture, patience in his eyes. Mark had begun to feel proud, until one evening the calm shattered. It was a Thursday night, quiet like most. Rain tapped against the windows while Mark sat at the kitchen table, reviewing some old paperwork. Brutus lay nearby, chin resting on his paws, body completely relaxed. Then, a sudden crack outside. Not thunder. A door slam? No. Too sharp. Too close. Brutus's head shot up. Mark stood slowly listening. A second noise, this time a thud near the back gate. Brutus growled. Low, deep, primal. Mark moved to the window and pulled the curtain back. A man stood in his yard, soaked in rain, hood pulled low, one hand gloved, the other holding a crowbar. Mark's pulse surged. Before he could react, the man moved toward the side door, the one near the garage. The motion light flickered and buzzed, barely illuminating his figure. Brutus was already on his feet. No, Mark said, stepping in front of him. Stay. Brutus growled louder, not out of fear, but purpose. The man reached for the door handle. Mark bolted to the drawer and grabbed his phone, but fumbled it, the device skidding across the floor. Too late. The door began to creak open, and in that instant, Brutus moved. He launched forward with explosive power, his body nothing but muscle and instinct. He slammed into the door as it cracked open, forcing it back shut with a bang. The intruder stumbled. Brutus barked sharp, thunderous, the kind of bark that cut through bone. Mark followed, heart pounding. Brutus! Down! The dog stood rigid, pressed against the door, growling deep in his throat. Outside, the man cursed, turned and ran, his footsteps retreating quickly into the rain-soaked night. Mark opened the door cautiously, scanning the yard. Gone. He backed inside and locked it, his hands trembling. Brutus still stood by the threshold, chest heaving. Mark reached out and gently touched his back. It's okay, he whispered. You did good. Brutus turned, his eyes intense but not wild. Mark crouched down, face to face. You protected me, just like you were trained to. Brutus licked his hand once, then sat down. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur. Mark called the police, filed a report, walked the property. They found footprints in the mud and crowbar dents in the back door. Looks like he picked the wrong house. The officer muttered, eyeing Brutus warily. Mark smiled faintly. Yeah, he really did. When the house finally fell quiet again, Mark sat on the couch with Brutus at his side. But this time, something was different. The fear he once felt about Brutus's strength was gone. He had seen it now. How controlled, how deliberate, how protective Brutus truly was. I knew there was something more to you, Mark whispered, rubbing behind the dog's ears. You're not broken. You were just waiting for a reason. Brutus leaned into him, pressing his weight into Mark's side. For the first time in a long time, Mark didn't just feel safe. He felt grateful, because in a moment of danger, when instincts could have turned savage, Brutus chose control. He chose to protect, not destroy. And that changed everything. The next morning, the town was buzzing. News travels fast in small places, and when a break-in is foiled by a so-called dangerous dog, people take notice. Mark stepped into the local diner the following day, greeted by curious stares. It was the same place where weeks ago, folks had whispered behind their menus about that man who adopted the vicious one from the shelter. Now, they weren't whispering. They were asking, was it true? Did the dog really stop a thief? You're lucky that animal didn't hurt you too. Mark sat quietly at the counter, sipping his black coffee, Brutus lying at his feet. He's not what you think, Mark finally said, breaking the silence. He's not dangerous. He's disciplined, trained, protective. The waitress, a kind-eyed woman in her 60s, leaned closer. That dog's got history, Mark. Folks remember what happened with his last owner. Mark nodded slowly. And I've got history, too. Doesn't mean I don't deserve a second chance. The room fell quiet again, this time with thoughtfulness. Later that week, the local paper called. They wanted to run a story. Rescue Dog Forged Robbery, a headline begging to be printed. Mark hesitated. He didn't want fame. He didn't want attention. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to change the narrative. He agreed. The article ran on Friday. It told the story of a man grieving his old K9, finding an abandoned dog with a broken reputation, and discovering that the bond between them wasn't about obedience. It was about trust. Readers responded in ways Mark never expected. Cards arrived in his mailbox. Strangers stopped him in the park. One family, holding their child's hand, said, "Thank you for showing people dogs like him deserve a home." Even the shelter reached out. The same shelter that once said Brutus might never be adoptable. "We're getting calls," said the director over the phone. "People asking about other unadoptable dogs. They're saying if Brutus can find peace, maybe those dogs can too." Mark looked down at Brutus, lying comfortably on the porch, eyes half shut in the afternoon sun. "Good," he said softly. "They all deserve a chance." Still, not everyone approved. One man cornered Mark at the hardware store. "You're lucky," he spat. "That dog didn't snap. You wait. Dogs like that, they turn eventually." Mark didn't argue. He just looked the man in the eyes and replied, "You're wrong. What turns a dog isn't breed or past. It's how the world treats them." Brutus didn't need to be feared. He needed to be understood. And slowly, people were beginning to understand. Mark took Brutus to the park more often now. Off-leash. Still cautious, but never afraid. Children waved. Joggers nodded. Even the police chief stopped by one evening. "Got wind of the story," he said, watching Brutus with interest. "You ever think about retraining him formally? He's got the instinct. We could use dogs like him if he's truly stable." Mark smiled. "We're still working on the healing," he replied. "But I'll think about it." Because deep down he knew Brutus wasn't just changing his life. He was changing minds. And with every walk, every quiet moment of peace, every child's hand that gently touched Brutus's fur, the town's fear began to melt. Suspicion was turning into admiration. And the dangerous label? It was fading, replaced with a new word. Hero. Life had settled into something peaceful. Brutus had found his rhythm. Daily walks. Slow evenings on the porch. Children calling his name from across the street. He'd become something of a legend in town. The once feared dangerous dog had turned into a silent guardian, a local hero with a soft heart and a powerful stare. But one morning, everything changed again. Mark had taken Brutus to the vet for a routine checkup. Nothing serious. Just shots. Weight, wellness. As he filled out the paperwork at the counter, the receptionist tilted her head. "What's the name again?" "Brutus," Mark replied. She tapped a few keys, then frowned. "That's odd. He's chipped, right?" Mark nodded. "Yeah. Shelter confirmed that when I adopted him." She clicked again. "There's a match in the database, but it's not from our region. It's from 3 states over. A police department registry." Mark's eyebrows lifted. "A K9 chip?" "Yes. You may want to speak with someone." 2 hours later, a call came through. "Mr. Callahan?" The voice on the other end was firm, official. "This is Sergeant Miller with the Camden County K9 Division. We believe you have a dog that was listed as deceased nearly 2 years ago." Mark's heart dropped. "Deceased?" "Yes. K9 Unit Brutus. Badge number K9-413. Presumed killed in action after a warehouse raid gone wrong. He and his handler were caught in an explosion. Only the handler's body was found. The dog disappeared." Mark's voice was dry. "You're telling me this dog, my dog, is a missing K9 unit?" "We believe so. We'd like to come verify. With your permission." Mark hung up in disbelief. He looked at Brutus, sitting calmly by the door, his tail thumping once as if to say, "What now?" That night, Mark sat on the floor beside him. "You were one of them," he whispered. "That's why you listen like that. Why you move so clean. Why the shelter was scared of you." He ran a hand over Brutus's broad head. "You weren't dangerous. You were trained, then abandoned. You lost your partner. Brutus blinked slowly. Grief has no voice, but it lives in eyes. 2 days later, Sergeant Miller and a woman named Detective Reyes arrived. Brutus didn't bark when they stepped onto the porch. He stood. He walked slowly to the officer. And then he sat, just like a trained unit reporting for duty. Reyes knelt in front of him. "Brutus," she said softly, holding out her hand. "K9-413? Brutus didn't flinch. She gave a quiet command, one used only by his former handler. He obeyed. Her face crumpled. "I was there that night," she said. "I held his leash before they went in. He saved 3 officers before the blast. We searched for days, but when we didn't find him, we assumed." She choked up. Mark watched in stunned silence. All this time, Brutus had carried a story no one knew. A story of service, trauma, loss, and survival. Reyes looked up. "He remembers everything." Mark nodded, his voice low. "So do I." There was a long pause before Sergeant Miller asked, "What do you want to do?" Mark looked at Brutus, who now sat between them, silent and steady. "I want him to stay with me," Mark said firmly. "He's home now." Reyes smiled through her tears. That's all he ever wanted. And just like that, the truth was out. Brutus wasn't a mistake from the shelter. He wasn't a monster waiting to snap. He was a soldier, a partner, a hero who had been forgotten by the world, until someone finally chose to see past the scars. News of Brutus's true identity spread faster than Mark expected. Within days, the local paper ran a second feature. Once feared, now saluted, K9 hero found alive after 2 years missing. And this time, the story wasn't just about survival. It was about sacrifice. Brutus had served with distinction, protected lives, lost his handler, his partner, his human, during a chaotic raid, and then vanished, injured and alone. No one knew how he survived, but he did. And now, he had been rediscovered, not by a police unit or a rescue squad, but by a grieving man who had lost his own K9 partner. It was as if fate had drawn the two together. When the mayor heard the story, she called Mark directly. "We'd like to honor him," she said, "not just for his past service, but for what he's doing now. He's changed the way people see rescue dogs. Dangerous? No, brave." Mark didn't care for spotlights, but he knew Brutus deserved this. So one sunny Saturday, the town held a small ceremony in the park. Flags flew. Veterans stood at attention. Officers, handlers, and even former shelter workers gathered around a temporary stage. Mark stood beside Brutus, one hand resting gently on his collar. The mayor spoke first. "We once labeled this dog unadoptable," she said. "A risk, a burden. But what we failed to see was the trauma behind the behavior, the loyalty beneath the growl. And we almost let that go to waste." She paused, then turned to Brutus. "You served with courage. You lost everything. But you never gave up. And today this town thanks you." Applause echoed through the trees. Children held handmade signs. "We love you, Brutus. Not dangerous, devoted. Hero." Then came the moment Mark hadn't expected. The police chief stepped forward with a black velvet box. "We don't do this often," he said, "but some service never ends. Brutus, in recognition of your bravery, your loyalty, and your return to duty, even in retirement, we award you the Honorary Medal of Valor." He opened the box to reveal a small, gleaming medallion. Mark crouched beside Brutus and fastened it to his collar. "You've earned this," he whispered. Brutus didn't bark, didn't move, but for a second, just one, he lifted his head and let out a low, proud huff, as if he knew, as if he remembered every command, every mission, and now every cheer. That night, back on the porch, Mark looked out at the town, quiet again. No more whispers, only respect. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you," he murmured, scratching behind Brutus's ears. "You brought something back into this world. Into me." The old dog leaned against him gently, his body heavier now, but heart stronger than ever. For Mark, Brutus wasn't just a rescued dog. He was a healer, a partner, proof that broken doesn't mean worthless, and that even the most wounded souls can rise again if someone just sees them for who they truly are. And the world? The world had finally seen Brutus, not as a threat, not as a mistake, but as the hero he always had been. Seasons passed. Leaves fell, snow came, and spring followed again. Brutus grew slower. His steps, once crisp and alert, now carried the heaviness of years and memories. But even as time wore on his body, his spirit remained unshaken. He still greeted every sunrise from the porch beside Mark, still raised his head when children laughed in the street, still protected what he loved. Mark knew their time together was precious. Every walk was slower, every nap more frequent, but every moment was richer, carved deep with meaning. One evening, as the golden light bathed the porch, Mark sat beside Brutus, a blanket over both their shoulders. The medal still hung proudly from the dog's collar, tarnished slightly now, but shining all the same. "You were never the one who needed rescuing," Mark whispered, his voice low and soft. "I was—" Brutus let out a long breath, resting his head on Mark's knee. There were no more words needed, just presence, just peace. A few weeks later, the town awoke to somber news. Brutus had passed away in his sleep, peacefully, without struggle, beside a man who had once taken a chance on him when no one else would. The entire town felt it. Children left flowers on the porch. Officers sent condolences. The shelter that once feared him posted a tribute. "Not dangerous, just misunderstood. Thank you for teaching us." Mark buried him beneath the big oak tree in his backyard, the place where Brutus used to lie and watch the world with those steady, knowing eyes. There was no marble headstone, just a wooden plaque handmade with a simple inscription: "Brutus, hero, healer, home." And beside it, Mark planted a garden. Not just flowers, but strong things. Evergreens, tall sunflowers, resilient life. Because that's what Brutus was, a reminder that even through trauma, loyalty and love could grow back stronger. Mark stayed in that house. He still walked the same trail every morning, sometimes pausing at the tree, sometimes speaking softly as if Brutus still walked beside him. Because, in many ways, he did. The bond they shared wasn't just between man and dog. It was a bond of souls, each healing the other in ways no one else could understand. And though Brutus was gone in body, his legacy echoed through every corner of town. The local shelter changed its policy, no longer labeling dogs as unadoptable. Instead, they started a new program, Second Chance K9S, inspired by Brutus's story. Dogs with behavioral issues were given training, rehabilitation, and more importantly, patience, compassion, because one person choosing to believe had changed everything. And every now and then, a new adopter would stand in that shelter, nervously reading a card labeled "Caution," and a volunteer would smile gently and say, "Don't be afraid. Let me tell you about Brutus." Years later, Mark wrote a letter to a national K9 organization. He ended it with these words: "We talk about heroes in uniforms, with medals and commands. But sometimes the greatest heroes wear scars and walk on four legs. Brutus didn't just guard a town. He guarded my heart. And in doing so, he brought both of us home." The story of Brutus wasn't just a tale of rescue. It was a story of redemption, of seeing worth in the broken, of believing that love, real love, can turn fear into trust and silence into healing. And long after the porch grew quiet and the footsteps faded into memory, the legend of Brutus lived on, in every rescued dog, in every hopeful heart, and in every soul that dared to believe in second chances. If you were moved by this incredible story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an amazing tale like this. Stay with us for more heartwarming and unbelievable stories.